in ways that enable us to communicate, because communication is challenging. It's extremely challenging. And the more tools that we can use to be able to be more effective in the way that we communicate, that enable us to communicate in ways that are more succinct and enable us to get our point across in ways that people not only listen to them, but they understand them, they value them, they internalize them, recall them, and retell them, the better it is. Because when we can do that, we can instigate change. We can
Yeah.
make change happen. We can make things go the way that we really want it to do, because not only are we bought in, but the people that we're communicating with, the people that we're trying to influence, understand our voice and vision, and they want to be part of this. So, Vince, let's talk about this.
I was going to say, Ben, I thought corporate communication was just sending out like 1,000 very long emails, and everybody, of course, in the whole corporation is going to read every line of those emails and digest it.
Absolutely.
Surely.
Absolutely. It's just like they said, let's send out 30 directives a day
Yeah.
and see how productive people can be while they're having to sift through the minutia
Yeah.
that is those directives.
Yeah. We did. We actually pointed out in a corporate environment one time. I won't say which corporate. We actually calculated in there the amount of basically C-suite emails that would go out to everybody. If we actually read every single one of those in a day, it would take over an hour. That's a lot of productivity loss. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. It's just like each person who sends out an email believes that whatever that they're sending out, or whatever form of
Mhm.
communication they're using, is the most important thing.
Yeah.
Ergo, you have 10 people on the board of directors. Each one of them has a thought that has to go out that day. And all of a sudden, you're sifting through, okay, what's relevant to me? What's relevant to my team? How does it affect what I'm doing right now? It's not just reading it.
Yeah.
It's how do you engage with it? How do you disseminate it? And how do
Yeah.
you make sure that what is being asked of you is being understood not only by you, but the people who actually have to go out there and do something about it?
Yeah. And I'll give a little bit of a rude awakening for most of those executives in that as well, is if you've got neurodiverse team members, which you most likely do, by the way, your probably entire marketing team is neurodiverse. If you got anyone there with ADHD or autism, anything like that, even mildly on the spectrum, if you send a huge email out there, I can guarantee you it hasn't been read fully, because our brains aren't wired that way. Literally, when I see a page of just nonstop text on there, my brain just looks at it and says, I'm sorry, Vince, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to read this. I have to kind of force myself to chunk it down and read it in little bite size and then reread it again. But that's a lot of effort and a lot of, it really does drain your brain when you've got ADHD. So you've got to remember that not everybody is the same and not everyone is going to digest every single thing that you write down.
Yeah, and I don't even think you need to be neurodiverse. I mean, I sit there
Yeah.
and get, a 1,500 word essay with these long paragraphs.
Yeah.
I'll read and skim. I'll read and skim. Okay, first paragraph. Okay, is this relevant to me? Great. Okay, move on. Skim, 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 skim. Okay, what's the last paragraph? What are they trying to sum up? Okay, great. Move on forward. Did I get all of it? Maybe, maybe not.
Oh,
You
man.
know, and I
Yeah.
think that we need to think about when we have different people with different amounts of time, and in different jobs with different focuses,
Yeah.
how do we sit there and create a level of communication that does one of three things? First of all, it grabs attention.
Yeah.
Second of all, it keeps attention. And third of all, it translates relevant information, not in the way that you want it communicated, but in the way that they want to receive it. So
Love that.
let's talk about how that relates to podcasting and how we can utilize podcasting in order to be able to do this effectively and efficiently.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, the first thing to talk about on that is really simply that people consume information in different ways, as you've kind of said. So if you are somebody who is very oral or somebody even that's very visual, rather than someone that can just read a lot of text on the paper, then actually having a different way to receive that information is going to be a lot more powerful for you. So, and I know myself, I mean, just think about the fact that most of you are listening to this, and most of you are watching this, How many of you read books versus actually listen to audiobooks? And how many of you listen to podcasts? I mean, how many of you are watching this right now? You're not reading the text on this. It is a different way to consume information, which is a great way to kind of disseminate that to various people in the way that they like to receive information.
Right. And that's an interesting point. Some people will watch this, some people will read the transcript, and some people will listen to it while they're doing something else.
Yep.
And how you interact with that piece of information can determine what you get out of it.
Yeah.
My son will sit there and watch a movie while he's writing a paper, while he's studying for something else at the same time. God knows how he does it, but he does it. Most people are not like that. Most people, sit there and say, okay, I've got a dedicated chunk of time. I need a quiet space, and I need to sit there. Okay, this is important. I need to concentrate on this. The question is, when you're developing that, how do you develop a strategy to be able to do that effectively? Because podcasting enables us to, disseminate information across a wide variety of mediums. It's not just the podcast itself, it's all the pieces of content that you can create out of it. So how do we create a strategy utilizing podcast as a first tier information dissemination piece to be able to use that podcast to be able to enable people across the spectrum, across the company, across the influence base to get what they need?
I love that. Yeah. And I think the first point of call is very simple. You've got to look at obviously what information you want to disseminate anyway, but also look at what's interesting for people. But the other thing is you need to think about the voice. And I don't mean the voice like Ben and Mai's voice here, but I mean, you need to think about, is this something that's going to be incredibly boring? Which I mean, by that, I mean like the CEO just constantly talking about information for the company, or is it something that you can evolve people from throughout the organization? Is it something that can bring the voice of everybody within this and therefore becomes something that people want to not only listen to, they want to be a part of as well? And I think if you start from that kind of premise of going, actually, this is the voice of the company, this is something we can bring people into, then you can kind of start from creating that content and looking at how we can kind of reuse that content elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, is to sit there and say, okay, when you create a podcast, sit there going, who are going to be the voices of the podcast?
Yeah.
I mean, just you're right. If you're always listening to the same person, you're only getting one point of view. When you break the podcast up so you're interviewing different people across the company, you get not only their perspective, but you get their thought leadership. And you get, how does this affect my department? How does this affect the departments I work with? What is my perception of how what I'm doing affects the organization as a whole?
Yeah.
And that's important to think about, is that all of a sudden you're sitting there going, wait a second here. Okay, this person's an expert in this part of the company. Great. Let's hear it from them. And I think that's really an important thing that a lot of people miss.
Oh, and there's also a kind of ancillary benefit to that as well, because not only are you getting the voice of that team, for example, you got someone in the team being interviewed on there, talking about what they're doing, talking about the importance of different aspects of it. Not only is that important in itself, but the other thing is you get the buy-in of that team, because you achieve something that most corporate communications fails at, which is you make people feel seen and heard. You make it feel like you make them feel important within there, because it's like, hey, actually, they're paying attention to the marketing team or to the operations team or the finance team, because your voice is being represented on there. I will say this though, Ben, like, honestly, just remember one very important thing. Not everybody has a voice for podcasting.
No.
And I say that because one of my favorite podcasts, it is a podcast that I want to listen to, because the content, it's all about copywriting, and I won't name it because I don't want to embarrass them, but it's some of the best content out there. The problem is I can't listen to it because the two hosts are the most like subdued people I've ever heard. And they're like, and in this episode, we will be talking, and I'm seriously, I'll fall asleep. I'll fall asleep within minutes listening to it. So just remember, not everybody is podcast ready, but having voices that can be on there and then interviewing people that aren't necessarily podcast ready, that can work really well, because you can bring the energy from whoever the host is, whoever the interviewer is.
Yeah, and that's a key thing. is
Yeah.
having a great host. Because a great host, whether there's somebody inside the company and outside the company, and I'll talk about that in a second,
Yeah.
gives you the ability to have somebody who can enable people to shine. And
That's right.
that's really the role of a host. The role of
And
the
it's an
host,
art form as well.
it
Yeah.
is. It's a complete
Yeah.
art form. It's not about how smart you are. It's not about how important you are. It's not about how your status within the company. It's
Yeah.
about how can you enable people to tell their stories in an effective way. And it says, I like, especially when we're dealing with a corporate podcast, I
Yeah.
like bringing somebody in from outside the company to host that podcast for one reason and one reason only. First of all, actually, two reasons.
Yeah.
One, they make no assumptions.
Yeah.
They're curious. They don't know what they don't know. And therefore it enables them to ask questions that somebody who's inside baseball and knows the vernacular, knows this, may never ask, and therefore creates conversations that may not happen within the organization. Second of all, if I'm outside the organization interviewing people, it doesn't matter if you're the president of the company, the CEO, somebody on the board of directors, the finance manager, the head of the legal team. None of these, I don't report to any of you people.
Yeah.
And there's no point where I'm sitting there going, I'm scared to ask a particular question, or I'm scared to go a different way within an interview because I think, oh my God, I could get fired, or I can't talk to my boss's boss that way.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of things that need to be thought of that way. Be able to sit there and say, how do you create a podcast that is going to be not just placating people, but actually pushing people and pushing the envelope in a way that's beneficial.
Yeah.
It's not combative, but it enables people to sit there and go, oh, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah. I just thinking, I was just imagining a corporate environment without the politics. That's crazy talk, Ben. So I also love the way you said there with it's not about, like, even if it was someone internal, it's not about the status, it's not about the position. It's actually almost the opposite of that. And that's why bringing an external person in, I think, adds another layer of value there, which is you don't have the ego. You
Right.
don't have somebody that's constantly trying to, and you see this a lot with other podcasts. I've been on podcasts before where the host is really insecure and
Mm-hmm.
you're there as an expert. So they're trying to show you that they know more than you and usually embarrassing themselves. But actually removing that ego by getting somebody external in means that you have the opportunity to just make people shine. Their whole job there is to make whoever it is that they're interviewing, to get the gold out of them, extract all the information out of them that's important, but also to make them look good and feel good. And it's an incredible experience if you get that right host.
Yeah. And as much as I agree with that, something I forgot to add is
Yeah.
that you can't be a podcast host off the side of your desk, because if you've got 100 other things that you're doing, oh my God,
Yeah.
I didn't get around to doing the podcast this week. There should never be an excuse of why the podcast episode doesn't go out on a consistent basis, whether you do
Yeah.
it monthly, whether you do it weekly, whether you do it daily. There, you need to have somebody whose job it is, and this is what they're being paid for, to produce the podcast and make sure that it goes out on a timely basis and that the information is current, relevant, and and timely.
Yeah. And that's a really good point too, because people underestimate the amount of production work that's actually involved in a podcast. It's not just a case. I mean, look, you can get started very easy with a podcast, literally by grabbing your phone and pushing record. Okay, just as a podcast host. But the reality is, if you're doing something in a corporate environment, within an organization, you will want to edit that. You will want good quality audio or video and things like that as well. So actually making sure you're using an external team can actually take away a lot of the pressure of that. Actually, they can produce it. They've got deadlines. They'll make sure it's on time. Nothing internally is going to impact that. It's like some project your marketing team's working on isn't going to impact whether or not they can actually produce a podcast episode this week.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a team of 75 people in the Philippines that
Yeah.
all they do is produce podcasts. Now, they don't all work for me. It's a service that I subscribe to, but that's
Yeah.
what these people do. 8 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. I'm sure they try it off. Nobody works 7 days a week. Hopefully they don't work 7 days a week. I'd be really upset if they did.
Yeah.
But what it enables you to do is say, hey, listen, my podcast drops at 10 o'clock in the morning every
Mhm.
Tuesday. As long as I give them enough time to produce it and we have a regular schedule, I know that 10 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, that episode's going to drop. And it's amazing how many people look for that, whether it's internal or external stakeholders. They're
Yep.
looking for that consistency. Nothing questions people's loyalty more to a podcast when they look at the podcast and they go, oh, that was 8 days ago, that one was 13 days ago, that one was 60
Yeah.
days ago, then they missed 3 months, and then they produced two or three episodes. You need to have a consistent schedule if you want to build loyalty, and if you want people to actually tune in and
Yeah.
listen on a regular basis and have it utilized as a communications tool within the organization.
Oh my goodness, man! I one of my favorite podcasts ever was an hour late one day. Which, oh, well, I thought they were an hour late one day, and I was like, I'm horrified. This is normally the time I listen to this podcast. What's going on? Turned out I forgot about daylight savings switchover. But anyway, but it is in your mind. Like if you expect something a certain day of the week, certain time of the day, you expect that because you want them to do exactly what I was doing with that podcast, which is to get into a routine, to make
Right.
it habitual that you're actually going to listen to this, make it something that they look forward to. And then you end up with the flow on benefit. We've talked about this in a previous episode of this, but the other benefit of this is, if you think about water cooler talk, you think about what people talk about in the lunchroom or around the water cooler and things in an organization. Most of the times it's stuff that doesn't really help your business. Most of the times it is things like, what's happening on the latest TV show, or, did you see this, or what's happening in the news and things like that. And nothing wrong with that. You want to create that kind of environment where people can talk. But just imagine if what's happening within your organization became the topic of choice, where people around the water cooler going, oh, did you catch the podcast? Oh my goodness, did you hear that Eric was on there? Like, that was hilarious when he said this and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't know that team were working on that project. Neither did I. Oh my goodness. And actually creates a way for people to, it creates a commonality, but
Yeah.
also creates a way for people to engage with each other. When they go up to Eric and say, hey, Eric, I heard you on the podcast. I didn't realize. Tell me more about what you guys are doing. So it actually creates a culture of the business itself, the culture of the corporation.
Right.
And within there, people getting really excited about what you're working on. So there's so many benefits to this.
Well, and that's the key thing is a podcast enables people within the organization who may never meet each other,
Yeah.
who may never directly work with each other, to understand what's going on in various parts of the company, to sit there
Yeah.
and say what's the big thing, what's the big innovative thing that happened in the Japanese office, what's the big thing, that innovative thing that they're working on down in Orlando or
Yeah.
Berlin. And you're never going to meet these people, and you work, sometimes it's day when it's night there, and vice versa. But
Yeah.
because of the asynchronous nature of podcasts, you can sit there and be a fly on the wall and listen in and say, wait a second here. That's a great idea. I wonder how we can implement it here. Hang on. Who is the person that they were interviewing? Okay, let me just go into the internal directory, look this person
Yeah.
up, schedule a WebEx or a Zoom call or a Teams meeting or whatever it is, find out in greater detail about how they did what they did, and
Yeah.
say, do you guys have any materials on this that we can implement on our team and be able to do this and be able to work on it together? And that's how ideas spread. That's how there's efficiencies within organizations. That's how brands are built. That's
Yeah.
how, onboarding happens more effectively. There's so many different things that a corporate podcast can do because it enables people to sit there and go, wait a second here. That's a great idea. I never thought of that. Why don't we
Yeah.
try that here?
I love that. Well, that is a very nice segue, because you mentioned there that you can use this for onboarding, but this is the other thing people don't really understand about podcasts is you're creating content, and that content can be used in so many different ways. So let's talk about, Ben, some of the ways that you've seen these podcasts being used throughout a corporation outside of just the podcast itself.
Yeah. I mean, training and development is one big thing. I
Yeah.
mean, think of all the things this, wait a second here. You have an enormous amount of information that's going out every single week. Say you're doing a weekly
Yeah.
podcast. That's 50 podcasts a year that have insights in it that can be broken down and say, wait a second, there's a 5-minute training piece on this within that
Yeah.
35-minute podcast. Great. Break that out and put that back into the training library. And that's coming from the expert in that particular field. We don't
Yeah.
need to re-record it. We don't need to, the video's there, all the information's there, and it becomes part of a repository. Onboarding. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Think about
Yeah.
onboarding large groups of people. We had an organization, they were a 50,000 employee company. They bought an 8,000 person company. To traditionally onboard those people is about $3,500 a person. So we're talking about 24 to $30 million. If you can create an internal podcast that talks about mission, vision, culture, vision, you know, you know, all of those things, you could run it
Yeah.
for a year, year and a half for less than 5%
That's
of
crazy.
what it would have cost you to be able to run that, to be able to run that 3-day onboarding program. And it's going to be far more effective. You're going to lose far fewer people, and those people are going to be far more engaged.
Yeah.
There's so many different things that you can think of. Think about things that your marketing department can take those communication pieces and be able to say, wait a second here, I can augment these things, basically take out the need to know stuff and be able to
Yeah.
use that for marketing pieces. You can interview clients and say, so what do you think about this? And be able to have voice of customer that your teams can listen to directly and say, listen, our customers are saying this in this is in their voice.
Yeah.
There's tons of different things that you can do with a podcast.
I love that. I love that when you said you're doing a weekly podcast that's 50 episodes a year, my brain was like, oh, Ben, oh, you're doing maths poorly. Then I realized, oh, wait, normal people have holidays. I keep forgetting this. So, yeah. But no, you're exactly right. And the thing is, too, it doesn't even have to be in the same format. Like, you record a podcast, podcasts are traditionally audio, but they can be video as well. So you can do a video podcast, and that video can be used, as Ben said, in the training material. Even the audio can be used in the training material and onboarding. But also you can transcribe those podcasts very easy. And there's heaps of software out there that will do that for you. Even built into Microsoft now with Copilot, you could easily get it to transcribe any video files. Use that in your training documentation. And again, that's taking the content from a format that people like listening to, and putting it into a format that other people find useful. For those that don't have ADHD that like reading, they can actually kind of break it down and read it in that format as well. So many different ways you can do that. And then that voice of the customer, I think that's such a powerful thing to bring into it, Ben. Like just being able to tell those stories. One of my favorite things about working in corporate, and I say that hesitantly because I didn't really enjoy working in corporate too much, but with some of the things I did enjoy there was when we had those stories come through of
Yeah.
what a team member at the front line had done to help one of our customers, and the feedback that we got from that customer. It's things like that that actually make you proud to work where you work. And if you can bring those stories to life through a podcast, you create such brand loyalty and such employee branding within the organization as well.
Yeah, and case studies. Think of the
Yeah,
case studies that can come out of it. It's just say, we met this customer, this was the challenge that they had, this is how we
yeah,
fixed it, and have the customer on the podcast and talk about it from their point of view. So you have 3 or 4 people being interviewed at the same time, and you can build a transcript or a short video or whatever
yeah,
of that becomes case studies that can go up on the website. I mean, there are so many different things you can do. And, I'm thinking about when you're talking about this is that, when you take the video, you can
yeah,
also use a program. And I think we've mentioned this before, a program called Hey Gen that
yeah,
allows you to be able to translate the video into multiple languages. And
yeah,
what it does is it all of a sudden our lips start moving and
yeah,
Japanese starts coming out, or
yeah.
Taiwanese or French or German or or
It's quite surreal.
whatever.
Not
And it
just, and that's the beauty of that as well. It's not just suddenly that you've got some, anime-based Japanese voice or something. It's actually in your voice in a
exactly.
different language. It is surreal when you see it.
Oh, it's extremely powerful, and what it
Yeah,
allows you to do is if you've got 5,000 people who speak Taiwanese far better than they speak English or German or French or whatever, you can
yeah,
provide them in the information in their native tongue. Now, is it 100% perfect? No, but it's getting there.
yeah,
And you can always
yeah,
augment and be able to send the, just wait a second here, caveat, we meant to say this when we said that,
yeah,
and those things do come up. But you need to be able to sit there and say, okay, here's how we get the information out quickly in the language of the audience in a way that they can sit there and say, okay, I'm comfortable listening to this. And when they're
Yeah.
comfortable listening to it, they're going to be far more responsive and they're going to internalize it far easier.
I love that. And I think you and I do a pretty damn good sales pitch on why you should actually consider having a podcast in your corporation, because honestly, it's just a no-brainer. It makes sense. But I'm just thinking through, Ben, the questions that anyone listening to this probably have right now. And one of them is, okay, what size corporation does this fit? What size organization do you have to have before having an internal corporate podcast makes sense for you as a way to disseminate this information?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that you're probably looking at organizations if you really truly want. It all depends how sensitive the information you want it to be.
Yeah,
Does this thing have to be private and secure? Or is it just a way to be able to use the information to disseminate information? And there's no harm, no foul if the information gets out into the world.
yeah,
If there's no harm, no foul if the information gets out in the world, you can be a company of 20. You could be a company of 5,
yeah,
and it works.
yeah,
Um, if you want an internal, private, secure podcast behind closed doors that's stream only, the information stays behind the firewall, you're probably
yeah,
looking at about 1,000 people above. You know,
yeah.
and
That
you know,
makes
and
sense.
when you're dealing with all the bells and whistles, you're probably looking at companies that are 20,000 people and above.
Yeah. And I would actually argue that anyone that has 20,000 people or over definitely should have an internal podcast, just
Absolutely.
because of the power of that, as we said. I was just picturing that when you said a team of 5, 5 people in an office and a guy in the corner or a girl in the corner going, "All right," and recording the podcast and then broadcasting it to the other 4 people that have no doubt just heard them recording it anyway. So, yeah, I love this.
It all
But you
depends
brought,
on whether
yeah,
the company. I mean, in 5 people,
yeah.
it's whether you work asynchronously across the country.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Actually, a really good point if you've got a lot of work from home team as well. If
Exactly.
everyone works from their own office or own home, really good way to kind of bring people together. Now, you kind of mentioned something there about the fact that it depends on how secure it needs to be. So we're talking about internal corporate podcasts here for communication, but there's also the other side of this as well, isn't there? Which is the external corporate podcast,
Right.
to disseminate information not just to staff, but actually to customers, to potential customers, and things like that as well. So, what are some of the benefits you've seen of a public-facing podcast for a corporation?
It's thought building. It's trust.
Yeah,
It's differentiating yourself in the marketplace. It's enabling you to be able to sit there and say, I understand what my customers need. I understand what my customers' hopes, wants, fears, desires, aspirations, and wants are. And I'm going to create something that gives them information that's going to make their life better.
yeah.
That's what a podcast is all about. It's not a and for $29.95 you can buy X, Y, and Z on this website. Go to www.xyz.com.
Oh
That's
man,
not why you
yeah,
create a podcast. You create a podcast to be able to sit there and say, okay, I understand my client base. I understand that they have these particular needs, wants, fears, and desires. How
yeah,
do I help them achieve their goals? How do we help them move their needle? And when you do that, it builds loyalty. The
yeah.
information spreads, and all of a sudden you become the repository of information, and that's why people come to you to buy.
I love it. Plus, the other thing you do, you achieve the holy grail. You actually give a personality to a corporation, and
Absolutely.
we kind of forget that people, unless it's purely transactional, like buying a toothbrush. But even then, I could make an argument that people don't buy products; they buy from people. They don't
Yes.
buy from a brand necessarily; they buy from a personality. And if you, as a corporate, especially if you're a large corporate with over 20,000 people, and you have a personality behind that. You've got an external facing podcast with voices on there, talking to team members on there, talking to frontline staff, talking to executives, being able to get the voice of that organization out there. Then people start to understand who you are, what your personality is, what's important to you as a corporation, and they
Mhm.
feel that kind of pseudo social connection with you. They almost feel like they know you. In fact, one of my favorite, in fact, the podcast host that I use, one of the things that I love is there's a podcast that they produce themselves. They kind of eat their own lunch.
Yeah.
And they put a podcast out there. So I feel like I know the team, even when I'm interacting with them, even though it's a very large company, even though when I'm interacting with them, I feel like I know them. And therefore, by the way, thinking about churn, Like, because I've been approached by a lot of other podcast hosts to say, hey, you should come over to us. I'm like, yeah. But I kind of know these guys, even
That's
though, by
right.
the way, I've never met a single one of them. And I've never actually talked to any of them face to face or voice to voice. I've just heard them on that podcast.
Yeah, and that's the important thing to say is all of a sudden you're creating a reason for people to be loyal.
Yeah.
And you're creating a reason for people to say, yeah, the other people are $5 a week cheaper, but I don't
Yeah.
care.
Yeah.
Like I just don't care. And I think that that's the important thing, to sit there and say, you're building a reason for people to want to do business with you.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I'm going to say, back to the whole content thing, is you're providing a wide variety of content. With every episode, you can build, you know, uh, audiograms and short videos and transcripts and tweets and all, and Instagram posts and all that kind of stuff, and all that information can be shared on the social media channels of your team members, therefore distributing the reach of the podcast. So it's a
Yeah.
matter of being able to enable your teams to, first of all, be proud enough to want to share it, and
Yeah.
then giving them information to share.
Yeah. Honestly, it is a marketer's dream. You just got content coming out your ears, which is awesome. So I love this. Yeah. The other thing too is podcasts are about storytelling. They're not just, like Ben said, they're not just, hey, buy this for $9.95 or whatever. They really are about talking to people and telling stories. And people love stories. They connect to stories. And this is the thing we forget. I look at my kids, their purchasing decisions, like particularly my son. He kind of went through early stage. He'll get embarrassed by this, Ben. We went through early stage up till about his teenage years, going, I don't care what I wear. He didn't really care about clothes too much. And all of a sudden, for some reason, he was around a lot of girls, and now he really cares about what he wears. But I
Absolutely.
watched his decision process around this, and he could go and buy a pair of jeans, pair of Levi's, pair of whatever. But there was one brand that he would only buy. In fact, still to this day, they're the only jeans he buys. And it's because of the story. And it's because they told their story. In fact, he shared their story on a podcast where they were talking about the fact that jeans are actually really bad for the environment because of so many different factors within there, but they want to mitigate that. So they deal with every aspect of the process to try and make it more sustainable and more environmentally friendly. And that meant something to him. So therefore, he will only ever buy that brand because of that story and that connection he has to the story.
Well, that's a great place to wrap things up, because storytelling is what this is all about. That's
Yeah.
what podcasts are all about. That's the reason you do a podcast,
Yeah.
is to enable stories to not only be told by you, but by the people that are listening to it. And I think we need to sit there and say, what are the stories we want other people to tell about us?
Yeah.
What are the stories we want people to share? And why is it important for them, A, to listen, B, to care, and 3, to share? And
Love that.
that's how we create podcasts. So thank you guys for listening. Every single month, Vince and I are going to be doing another one of these, trying to give information of how to create podcasts that are going to be effective, that are things that are going to make people's lives better, and are going to be able to, help you guys move your needles and achieve your goals. So I'm Ben. This is Vince.
Yeah.
And until next month.
See you guys.